Like many Beatles fans, I've always wondered if Hollywood would ever produce a definitive Beatles biopic. Well, on February 20th, 2024, it was announced that Sony Pictures Entertainment, in collaboration with Apple Corps, will be doing just that. I guess the recent wave of successful biopics has proven that there's a market for movies about legendary musicians. Speaking as a bit of a Beatles fan myself, I can say that I'm very excited about these films, but I wouldn't be a self respecting Beatles fan if I didn't have some questions. A Beatles biopic comes with some really interesting challenges that set it apart from others in the genre. So I've done some reflecting and put together 9 key questions that I think the filmmakers will need to get right in order for this film to work. So let's get into it on the art of storytelling. As of the time of recording, we know next to nothing about this project. We don't know who will be cast as the Beatles. We don't know who's writing the scripts. We have no idea what the story will be. What we do know is that it will be directed by Sam Mendes, who has directed several excellent films, including American Beauty and 1917. We know that Apple Corps has granted full life story and musical rights to the filmmakers for the first time ever. And that's actually a pretty big deal because it suggests that a lot of work has already been done behind the scenes to develop and approve a concept. We know that Paul and Ringo have given their blessings to the project, along with Sean Lennon and Olivia Harrison. And we know that according to the film's producer, nothing is off limits. But surely the most striking revelation is that the story will be told in 4 parts. That's 4 feature films, 1 for each band member. And each of these films will get a theatrical release sometime around 2027. So, with that basic information in mind, let's start with question number 1. Is this a definitive Beatles story? There have been so far around 18 unauthorized Beatles biopics over the years with varying commercial and critical success, and each of these puts the Beatles story in a very different narrative frame. So, there's the 2009 film Nowhere Boy, which focuses on John Lennon's teenage years, tells the story of his mother being killed in a road accident, his relationship with Aunt Mimi, his first encounters with Paul, the formation of the Quarrymen. It doesn't show anything past 1960. There's also the 1994 film Backbeat, which focuses on the Beatles' early days in Hamburg. The main character is actually Stuart Sutcliffe, the band's former bass player, and it's about his relationship with John Lennon and Astrid Kircher. And there's the 2000 film Two of Us, which tells a fictionalized story based loosely on the real-life event of John and Paul hanging out at the Dakota 6 years after the band's breakup. There is, of course, a good reason why these films focus on a very specific event in the Beatles' story, and that's because any comprehensive account of the Beatles' career would be next to impossible to cover in one movie. And this might be one of the justifications for spreading the story across 4 films. I think a lot will come down to whether the filmmakers are striving for that comprehensive telling of the Beatles' story. And as much as I'd like to see the Beatles' story rendered in exhaustive detail on screen, I have to say that a sensible screenwriter will probably caution against this and instead focus on question number 2. What is the central conflict? Movies need drama, and drama needs conflict. So the writers will inevitably need to make a decision about what the central conflict of the Beatles' story is. What will be the source of the story's dramatic tension? There's a few things to choose from here. There's the complex relationship between John and Paul that's full of lots of love and camaraderie, but also has a lot of rivalry and sometimes complex feelings of jealousy. There's the conflict with the fact that George and Ringo were often overshadowed by the Lennon-McCartney duo, leading to tensions in the studio and beyond. And of course, there's the often vilified Yoko Ono and her purported role in breaking up the band. But we need to remember we're talking about 4 films, and each one will have a different conflict at its core. I think the hardest part about making 4 films is figuring out the motivations for all 4 main characters in all 4 films. Altogether, these movies will have a total runtime that is similar to the Lord of the Rings Extended Edition. That's an epic scale for any story, and if the audience is meant to consume these films as a single episodic story, the writers will need to write character arcs for the Beatles that can justify that runtime, as well as the purchase of 4 movie tickets in 1 year, which is definitely an untested release strategy. Consider this: what kind of dramatic question can sustain Paul McCartney's character arc across 4 feature-length films? What is his ring to destroy, something that will culminate in a satisfying resolution after 8 to 10 hours of runtime? Or will Paul's arc only be present in his film? In other words, will his character be relegated to a supporting role in John, George, and Ringo's films, and vice versa for each? That's a really difficult dramaturgical question. And if I was Sam Mendes, that one would keep me up at night. This plugs into question number 3. How will the narrative be structured? We know that the story will have a fragmented narrative across 4 films, and that each film will focus on a single character. So one prediction I think we can safely make is that each film will cover a different time period in the Beatles' career. There's a pretty simple reason for this. It doesn't make sense for all 4 movies to cover the same events. Take the iconic moment when Paul plays 20 Flight Rock for John for the first time.
I got a girl with a wrecking machine. When it comes to rocking, she's a queen.
I can't imagine that not being in a Beatles biopic, so that would either be in John's film or in Paul's film, but it probably wouldn't make much sense to have it in both films. So it's much more likely that the story will take place in 4 distinct Beatles eras, something like the early years, Beatlemania, the psychedelic period, and the later years. Each of these periods has a different aesthetic quality reflected in things like their hairstyles, their facial hair, their fashion choices, not to mention the transition from black and white to color media, which could be a useful visual device for distinguishing the films. And of course, there's the changing backdrop of the radical cultural transformations that occurred throughout the 60s, in which the Beatles were, of course, very much involved. The challenge is that the separation of the time periods would mean that each period is shown through one Beatles perspective at a time. And that's also a really difficult puzzle to solve. Which Beatles perspective is the best fit for each era? Should John's story carry the first film because he was more of the band leader in those days? Which era should be carried by Ringo's story or George's story? Which Beatles should the series end on? This is one of many dilemmas introduced by the separation of the Beatles into 4 individual stories. You know, on one hand, it seems like a good idea to give each character his own movie, but the thing about characters is that they don't exist in a vacuum. It's their relationships with the other characters that define them. I'm reminded here of Disney's harebrained decision to give Han, Luke, and Leia their own character focus in episodes 7, 8, and 9, respectively. It's like some genius studio executive figured out that, oh, there are 3 legacy characters and 3 new films, and that's the same number, so it should be organized that way. And of course, that decision was disastrous. To be fair, it was probably made out of respect for those characters, with the thinking being that each character deserved their own film. But you can see the fallacy here. It's not the characters we love, it's their relationship to each other that we love. And not putting Han, Luke, and Leia on screen together was probably one of the biggest mistakes in film history. And I can't help but think that maybe that same fallacy might be lurking in the idea of splitting up the Beatles. So let's shift gears slightly with question number 4. Will the film strive for realism? This question is especially important for films that deal with real historical events, especially those that are relatively recent and therefore firmly planted in the cultural imagination. Plenty of biographical films have this problem. A good example is the 2013 film Jobs, in which the filmmakers recreate Steve Jobs' first introduction to the iPod. The problem is that the image of the Steve Jobs product announcement is so culturally entrenched that if he wasn't wearing white sneakers, blue jeans, and a black turtleneck, it wouldn't be a Steve Jobs product announcement. All I'm saying here is that the filmmakers were bound to certain production choices in that scene because the audience has expectations. Now consider the Beatles playing The Ed Sullivan Show for the first time, a major milestone in their career. You, the audience, have seen that image many times. You know exactly what Ed Sullivan looked and sounded like when he introduced them.
The Beatles!
You know exactly what the stage looked like. You can already play that movie in your head. If the filmmakers want to represent this event in the film, they'll have to decide whether they're aiming for a faithful recreation of that familiar image. It doesn't sound like such a huge challenge, but this problem is greatly compounded with the Beatles, whose image is culturally ubiquitous. If John Lennon isn't wearing a brown fur coat on the rooftop concert, that will be wrong. If they don't have mustaches when they're recording Sgt. Pepper, that will be wrong. If Paul's mop top doesn't shake with the precise amount of vigor, I'm walking out of the theater. I mean, you see what I'm saying here. It's not that the film must conform to those audience expectations. It's only that the film might suffer under the incredible weight of the responsibility that comes with faithfully representing the uniquely familiar image of the Fab Four. Question number 5. What are the defining Beatles moments? If we assume that the film will tell something approximating a definitive Beatles story, then what are the pivotal story moments. Naturally, the writers are going to look to the band's real history for inspiration, and there are a lot of iconic moments to choose from. There's Brian Epstein hearing them at the Cavern Club for the first time. There's the band recording Love Me Do, their first #1 with George Martin. The band getting off the plane at JFK Airport at the start of the British invasion. The concert at Shea Stadium. There's John saying they're bigger than Jesus. The release of Sgt. Pepper. The death of Brian Epstein. Maharishi and the trip to India, or the live worldwide broadcast of All You Need Is Love. To me, any and all of these feel like they're critically important to the band's story, and I'm sure you've already thought of a few more. If you think this through for just a few minutes, you realize that there are just too many defining Beatles moments for even 4 feature-length films to adequately cover. And this means the filmmakers will have to be very selective about which moments they feature as the defining moments of the band's career. You have a similar problem with question number 6, which is which characters will be featured. It's hard to imagine a definitive Beatles story that doesn't include George Martin, Brian Epstein, Yoko Ono, Linda Eastman, Pattie Boyd, the list goes on. And what about the other famous musicians in the band's social orbit, like Dylan or the Rolling Stones? The only point here is that the story of the Beatles involves many people who were not in the band, but who also feel essential to the story. And if you include one, you kind of need to include the other. So, for example, it wouldn't make much sense to have George Martin in the film, but not Brian Epstein, or Yoko, but not Linda. There will inevitably be controversy and politics surrounding this question, and that could pose a threat to the integrity of the story. Question number 7 is a doozy. Which songs will be featured? Now, this one might seem like I'm getting off track talking about the story, and with any other biopic, I would agree with you. But part of what I'm arguing in this video is that the Beatles are different in this way. Let me put it to you like this. If you had to give the Beatles biopic a song title as its film title, which song would you choose? The Queen biopic is called Bohemian Rhapsody, no brainer. The Elton John biopic is called Rocket Man, makes total sense. The Johnny Cash biopic is called Walk the Line. You see what I'm getting at here. With most artists, there's usually a song or an album or a lyric that symbolizes their career and legacy. This doesn't work as well if you try it with the Beatles because their career is so expansive and multifaceted that it's impossible to characterize it in one way. They produce music in every genre you can imagine. There isn't much aesthetic common ground between Twist and Shout and Tomorrow Never Knows. Their musical and artistic range is much greater than people like Elvis or Elton John, and that's not to diminish those artists or their music in any way. It's just that Elvis never experimented with a sitar or mixed tape loops of carnival sounds into his records. The Beatles pushed the boundaries of their art form, and that means they don't fit neatly into a box. And movies are all about fitting things into a box. Again, you can see the rationale for splitting the film up into 4 films here. So maybe they're thinking film 1 is called From Me to You, and film 4 is called Come Together or All You Need Is Love. And this would help to give the audience a sense of the artistic evolution of the band, and that might work. But my main point here is that the Beatles story is much more about their music and their art than it is for any other comparable artist who might get a biopic. The thing that makes their story interesting isn't the drama between the band members or their various love affairs or their battles with drugs or their struggles with fame. The thing that makes the Beatles interesting is their music and their process for making that music. They were artists and innovators first and foremost, and any film that is intended to honor their legacy should go pretty deep into the subject of how they wrote, performed, and recorded their music. And if A Day in the Life doesn't make the cut, I'm walking out. Now, question number 8. What is the moral of this story? This question relates back to the one about conflict. Assuming the Beatles are the main characters and that each has some kind of central conflict, what lesson will each Beatle learn at the end of his story? There's certainly no obvious moral arc in the overall Beatles story. I suppose in some ways it's a tragic story because, despite being extremely close, they ultimately broke up and sued each other and never got back together. My point is that there isn't really a satisfying ending for the Beatles, and actually there's kind of a lingering sense of melancholy in the fact that we never got the cultural catharsis of seeing John and Paul publicly reconcile or share a stage again. You could kind of feel this unresolved emotion in the recent release of the song Now and Then, which many people wanted to interpret as a song written by John for Paul. We want so badly to believe that their bond triumphed over all the animosity of their separation and that they're still a band, even today. So if I was writing this film, I'd be very careful about how I handled John's conflict with Paul, and especially how that conflict resolves. And it will need to resolve somehow because it's a film, and films, unlike real life, have moral resolutions. So the question will be, does love triumph over all? Or does John and Paul's relationship and separation teach a more complex and perhaps tragic lesson about how people who love each other can be torn apart? Either one could work. But if we assume that the filmmakers want to end the film on a more positive note, then the series will need a final moment of triumph for the band somewhere near the end of their career. And this would have to be their final performance on the rooftop at Apple headquarters. And if I had to guess, I'd say that's where the film's four stories will culminate and resolve. It would be great to have Alan Klein enter as a villain who tries to turn the Beatles against each other and take over their business. But then you'd want to see the Beatles overcome that threat with the power of their friendship. And we all know that's not really how things played out. The overall point here is that there isn't a clear lesson in the Beatles story, and the filmmakers might end up distorting reality a bit to put a happy ending on the Beatles story, where it must be said, there really isn't one. All of these questions ultimately point to the final question, question 9, which is, why tell a Beatles story? And this is the question every filmmaker must inevitably answer, ideally before they make their film. As a Beatles fan, I think there are many good reasons to explore the story and legacy of the Beatles in the biopic format, but only if the filmmakers have something new and meaningful to say about the Beatles, some kind of original comment or interpretation to bring to that story. I think I probably speak for a lot of Beatles fans when I say that one of the things I like about them is that, despite their mythic status, they still feel like real human beings. They somehow strike this balance of being totally untouchable and iconic, and yet also relatable and likable. That's always been a big part of their charm and intrigue. I'm struggling to say this the right way, but my point here is that there's just something about the Beatles that sets them apart, puts them in a different class, and might make them fundamentally incompatible with the standard biopic treatment. In a world where virtually every intellectual property has been strip mined for content, the Beatles brand has always seemed to be insulated against the culture industry's cynical and nostalgia baiting. So it's probably going to feel slightly weird to watch the Beatles get processed through the Hollywood dream factory, especially with whatever AI tools exist to manipulate the Beatles' image and sound. But to end on a note of optimism, Sam Mendes is an excellent filmmaker. He has a theater background and a very good sense of how to adapt stories for the big screen. And of course, the one big ray of hope is that Paul and Ringo have personally signed off on the project, and that will give the films the credibility of being an official Beatles product. And at the end of the day, anything that has the blessing of the surviving Beatles is something I'm very much interested in seeing. So, Beatles fans, I know you have thoughts. What are your fears, your hopes, your script notes for the Beatles biopics? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.